So it is with the Bloom's taxonomy. My story begins, I was a student of Bloom. I studied with him from 1970 to 1973. But I didn't know anything about the taxonomy. Ah, good, thank you. I didn't know anything about the taxonomy, and I didn't want to learn anything about the taxonomy. And one day, a former professor of mine, and this would have been about in 1993, came up to me and said, you know, it's almost 40 years since the taxonomy had been published. Someone should do something to honor that. And he looked right at me, and I hate when people do that, because you know who someone means. Someone is, you should do that. And then duty set in. Of course I should do that. I should pay tribute to what I consider to be a wonderful historical document. Because there are very few things in education, particularly in today's world, that last 40 years. If things last 10 years in today's world in education, that's a long life. So I set out, and I said to him before I left, there's only one problem. And he said, what's that? And I said, I've never read the taxonomy. So you're asking me to put together a book that honors something I've never read. And he said, yes, but I trust you to be able to do it. And we did. And it turns out that I'm not the only person who never read the taxonomy. As a matter of fact, Bloom said to me when I told him what we were doing, he said, don't feel bad, he said. The taxonomy of educational objectives is one of the most frequently cited, least read books in American education. Everybody can say the words. Knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. But if you've read it, you should know the answer to this question. And the answer to the question is, that's good, I'll change here. Oh, this, okay. That goes this way? Okay. If you've read the taxonomy, you know the answer to this question. What color is the cover? No. No. It's green. But that's okay. That's okay because that means not only haven't you read it, you haven't even seen it. Okay? Now it's changed in color because it's been reprinted a number of times. At one time, just for your edification, the taxonomy, they compiled the royalties from the taxonomy. My graduate assistantship came from money that the taxonomy generated, and then I felt very guilty because I'd never read it. At one time, after Bloom passed away, I was working with David Crothwell, who is a co-editor of this book. And I said, how much money is in that royalties? He looked at me and he said, approximately $2 million. That's a lot of sales of an education book. $2 million in royalties. So that's who I am. I'm a distinguished professor emeritus. Emeritus just means that I'm an ex. I've been married twice, and so I have a wife, and I have a wife emeritus. It's just a special way of giving real credit to people that have been in your life in the past. So I want to start with a question. The first question is, what is an objective, since this is a taxonomy of educational objectives? And this is where the confusion begins. Because if I hadn't shown you the answer, everybody has their own view of what an objective is. But if you're going to use the revised taxonomy or the original taxonomy or any other classification system, you have to buy into their particular definition. Their definition basically says, it just shows you how good of a translator I am, since I memorized it in English, says that an objective is an explicit formulation of the changes that you want to make in your students as a result of the educational process. Now, does that jive with your understanding of what an objective is? Probably not. And that leads us to one of our first problems. Because without understanding that, then all of a sudden, objectives, competences, standards, aims, and goals, they're all mishmashy together. But they're not. Explicit, yes, they're all explicit. Changes? No. Most competences and standards are end results by the end of school. Students should be here. Students should have learned this. What objectives are is, over third grade, students should move from here to here. And you see, if you have a competence or a competency that a third grader already has achieved, it's not an objective. It's something that the student already has mastered upon entry to third grade. That's why setting one set of standards or one set of competencies for all third graders or all pre-service teachers or all high school students, okay, doesn't do much to help us because it doesn't specify what changes do we want. And notice, as a result of the instruction they receive, we can set standards, we can set competencies, but if we don't know how to teach them, what good are they? If we don't know how we're going to help students achieve them, what good are they? All they do is get people upset. So that's all an objective is. So the second part is just what are the implications of that? The implications are, they're very unique things. When you state an objective, and as a matter of fact, if you talk to teachers, teachers understand this intuitively. That's what objectives have always meant to teachers. I'm getting these kids at the beginning of second grade. When they leave me at the end of second grade, here's what I want them to look like, okay? Which makes second grade teaching so hard. Because as soon as you leave the students at the end of second grade and you start over again, you have to forget everything they know because the new group doesn't know that stuff. Okay? I used to teach middle school mathematics. I taught algebra 4 periods during the day. And I couldn't ever understand why, by the time the 4th period came along, I had 20 minutes left to spare that I didn't have at the beginning. And then I realized I was teaching more poorly every time I taught it because I had assumed that I already had taught it to these people. Okay. Is there a common grammatical structure for objectives? Yes. And this is key to helping you make sense of objectives. It's subject, verb, object. Okay? Subject, verb, object. Now, subject is always the student, or students, or learner, or the learners. And in the United States, if you go into lower grade classrooms, oftentimes you'll see on the chalkboard the following: T, L, W, B, A, T. That's abbreviation for the student will be able to. Because they don't want to write that every day. That's the subject. Then we move to the object. The object is the content. Might be I'm teaching about stars. Might be I'm teaching about sentence structure. Might be I'm teaching about diagramming sentences. It might be I'm teaching about energy. And then the verb is simply a matter of what do you want students to do or think about relative to that content. And that's really where the original objective, the original taxonomy came into play. It didn't deal much with the content, but it basically said, whatever the content is, you want them just to know it, or do you want them to comprehend it, or do you want them to apply it? Do you want them to analyze it? Do you want them to evaluate it, or do you want them to synthesize it? Okay? So here are a couple of objectives. Now I'm going back to things you're going to see. The change is implicit here, but just I want to show you the form. Right? That's the form. Notice the subject. I learned how to do this when I was in 5th grade, how to diagram a sentence. So you underline the subject, that's the student. You capitalize the verb. First one is analyze. Second one is exemplify or explain. I can't remember what I had there. Read it in the right language. Okay, let's see. Get to the right page here. Oh, explain. There we go. That's right. And the things in italics are basically the content. You can write these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of times. They all look alike. Okay? And that's the beauty of a classification system. It applies to all grade levels. It applies to all subject matters. Okay? Because that's the common ground. Okay? If you work with me at all, Maria knows this, I always seek out the common ground. That's my job. If I go into 2 different places, the first thing I look for is how similar are these 2 places? There are other people who the first thing they look for is what are the differences? And it's the differences that have divided us in education. The only thing that has any hope is we have a common ground. Make sure that students are going to make a transition successfully from 4th grade to 5th grade, from school to work, from school to college. Okay, how are we going to make sure that what we're teaching them in 6th grade prepares them for success in 7th grade? All right, a couple more things. A few more questions. Why was the original taxonomy developed? A little history lesson. If you don't like history, just put your head on your lap and we'll come back to you in a minute. But this statement was so incredibly well written. And by the way, if you look at the date, 1949 he wrote this. It took him 6 years. It took him 7 years to develop the original taxonomy. We were a lot better. It only took us 6 years to do the revision. Got smarter. But Bloom wrote, a taxonomy of educational objectives could do much to bring order out of chaos. It could furnish the conceptual framework around which our descriptions of educational programs and experiences could be oriented. It could furnish a framework for the development of educational theories and research. It could furnish the scheme needed for training our teachers and orienting them to, and I think this is the most important part of the entire statement, the varied possibilities of education. What could education be if we really put our mind to it? If we designed the ideal educational system, what would it look like? You know that one of the countries that is usually scoring very high on all of these international tests, country of one of my forefathers, Finland. And I asked a couple of the faculty members at the university, why? And he said, one of them said, Finland had a great gift given when the Soviet Union broke apart. Because up to that point in time, our entire educational system was modeled on the Soviet system. And when it broke apart, we had, for the very first time, an opportunity to start all over again and consider, what do we want our educational system to be like? What kind of students do we want to produce? What learning do we value? Do we want really smart people who hate each other? Do we want people who are really good memorizers but can't think? Do we want people who can think for themselves or simply follow directions? Those are not easy questions. In our country, the more conservative you are, the more you want people to follow directions. The more liberal you are, the more you want people to think for themselves. And those constraints impact greatly on the type of educational system that you have. Next. Am I going the wrong way? Is that new now? Is this where I was?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. I'm all right. It's been a long day. All right. This is an important slide. This is probably the most important slide. Everything else just kind of forget. But this one, pay attention to. The taxonomy is best thought of as a heuristic device. A heuristic device serves as a guide in the investigation or solution to the problem. It encourages a person to learn, discover, and understand problems on his or her own. Unlike algorithms, heuristics do not guarantee optimal or even feasible solutions, and are often used with no theoretical guarantee. Simply stated, then, the revised taxonomy is a tool that can be used wisely or poorly. That's up to the people who use it. Okay, you can come up with really great objectives, or you can come up with really terrible objectives. Now, people that blame their old original taxonomy for the kinds of objectives that came up. And I'm here to tell you, no. That was the users of the taxonomy that came up with those terrible objectives. Okay? And the people who use this one have come up with equally terrible objectives. But it's their choice. And it's based on their philosophy of education. All right. For those of you that need a refresher course, this is the original. Now, why did I use a triangle? I used the triangle. This is going to be important later on. I used the triangle because that's the way the original taxonomy was conceptualized. It was conceptualized as what was called a cumulative hierarchy. That is to say, what you had to do, thank you, I can't do all these things at the same time. Oh, you're way ahead now. I'm not that far. There, we're back. My lovely assistant will now take care of that for me. By cumulative hierarchy, it meant that knowledge needed to be gathered before moving to comprehension. And then you comprehended before you moved to application. And because of the time factor, there wasn't much time left in education by the time you got up to the top. If you had to cover all the knowledge and then all the comprehension and all the application, you're just going to run out of time. And that's what happened. It turned out that the first time this was applied at the university level, 80% of the objectives written by college professors in over 40 universities in the United States were written at the knowledge level. 80%. Now, bing! Thank you. Hidden away, and you won't find it until you go to an appendix. There's actually a proposed structure of this knowledge category. This is important for a different reason. You get knowledge of specifics, that is to say, knowing the terms, the facts, knowledge knowledge of ways and means of dealing with the specifics, knowledge of classifications, categories, criteria, methodology, knowledge of universals and abstractions, principles, generalizations, theories, and structures. Notice how complex that is. It goes from fairly simple kinds of knowledge all the way down to models and structures. And at the same time this was hidden, everybody thought, because of the last slide I showed you, that knowledge was the least important, least difficult of all. Okay? One of the negative implications of the taxonomy, or consequences of the original taxonomy then, was that knowledge became devalued. We just didn't think knowledge was that important. One of the lessons to be learned from the revised taxonomy is you need a balance. You need a balance of the noun and the verb. Too much noun, not enough verb, a lot of stuff learned at a very low level. Too much verb, not enough noun, a lot of good thinking, but about a spoonful of stuff. So how do you get a balance? How do you make sure you get the right amount of content and still at the same time get students who are able to analyze, evaluate? Difficult place to be. But we can do it if we work together. Next, please. Okay, what are the major differences? This is probably why you all came. Okay, first one. The nouns in the original taxonomy were transformed into verbs. That should be evident if you followed my logic so far. That the whole purpose of the original taxonomy was not to mess with the content, it was to really change the way people operated and thought about the content. What happened there is they got caught in the noun form, which messed everything up. So they made two mistakes. I hate to say this because I don't like to speak ill of the dead. But the two mistakes were embedding knowledge in some lost appendix and therefore devaluing it. Well, actually three. Secondly, having a cumulative hierarchy which limited the amount of time spent on the very things that they thought really defined an educated person. Analyze, synthesis, and evaluate. And lastly, using nouns instead of verbs, which made it think that we were classifying stuff as opposed to ways of operating on stuff. Well, we changed all that. Second thing we did was we went to 2 dimensions rather than 1. Why? This should also be self-evident. If you have the structure that says subject, verb, object, guess what? You need a dimension for the, and you need another dimension for the, right? Gotta have 2. The student is always embedded, so you don't have to worry about that. Next, please. More differences, 2 more. We got rid of the cumulative hierarchy. Why? Because the more we did, looked at the research on cognitive learning, cognitive psychology, cognitive science, it turns out that it was an artificial sequence. That is to say, you can analyze before you understand. Okay? You can evaluate after you apply. As a matter of fact, in mathematics, we do that all the time. Apply the algorithm, and one of the first things you should do then is evaluate, does that make sense? Does the answer make sense? Okay? So, think of the verbs, rather than a cumulative hierarchy, think of the verbs as tools in a toolbox. That's the thing I want you to keep in your mind. They're tools in a toolbox. You pick them out and you use them as necessary. Okay? One of the big shifts in reading that happens, people always talk about, oh, we go from learning to read to reading to learn. What does it mean to read to learn? It means to analyze material, to evaluate material, right? It means the difference between reading fiction and nonfiction. It's It's an awareness of the fact that reading a science textbook is different from reading history. All of this stuff is inherent in that, and it's not, that phrase doesn't catch it. But here, when you think of this as tools in a toolbox, you can do all that. You can do all that. And lastly, the intended audience is the classroom teacher, rather than college and university examiners. The original taxonomy was written by university examiners, of university examiners, for university examiners, used by university examiners. But we wanted to have something that spoke to teachers. Next, please. This is to show you how far we went. A lot of academics get upset or get criticized. Why? They get criticized because, oh, you come up with such complex jargon and definitions and stuff that nobody else uses. You just make this up. What I did here was to take our 6 categories, our 6 verbs, and we have some choices to make, which I'm not going to get into because I don't have the time. What you get in the second column is what we call the RBT. That's just our shorthand for Revised Bloom's Taxonomy. That's our definition. And then I, like a good modern day person, went to the primary source of real definitions, dictionary.com. I think everybody has to go there. And I wrote all of those definitions down in the third column. Now, I don't want you to spend a lot of time. Take a look at how utterly sophisticated and how academic we were in coming up with our definitions. Those definitions, other than create, are virtually the same. Why? Because that's who we wanted to speak to. Okay? We weren't writing for academics, we were writing for people to use it. So, 4 major differences. Next, please. The result is this thing called the taxonomy table. It has 4 types of knowledge down the side. Factual, conceptual, procedural, and metacognitive. And it has big categories across the top. Remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. Notice we put create at the top because we replaced synthesis with create based on some good advice that we got. And everybody agreed if you're going to have create in there, it has to be the highest. So we just switched it around. Underneath each of these, we have similar meaning words, because we do believe that these 6 categories basically encompass all the verbs that you will encounter in all of the attempts to write objectives and standards and competencies that you'll come up with some exceptions, and I can go into that if we have questions about it. But these are what the cognitive psychologists told us were cognitively different. Okay, and I'll give you an example from the first one. There are 2 verbs under remember. Recognize and recall. Now, I'll put you into a social situation. You're at a party. Had a couple of things to drink. Not seeing particularly clearly. And out of the corner of your eye, you see someone walking toward you. And you start getting a little bit nervous. Because you recognize the person, but you don't recall the name. You see, if that was the same verb, if that was the same cognitive process, that would be instantaneous. You'd recognize and recall. But we don't. And this also explains why some students, in terms of demonstrating learning, do better on multiple choice tests, which are tests of recognize, as opposed to supply tests, which are tests of recall. So, that is the end product. Next, please. Practical example. This is another reason to show you that I've given up my academic standing a long time ago. That's what emeritus is. Emeritus not only means X, it means I don't have to care anymore. Okay? I don't have to be this academic, highfalutin kind of guy. I can just tell it like I really think it is after lying for so many years to so many students. This is a recipe that it's one of two things I can make. Boiled eggs being one with the timer, and hot artichoke dip. Standard recipe. That's why I'm using a very practical example. This has a top part, has a bottom part. All recipes do. In human language, the top part are called the ingredients. The bottom part is typically called the procedure. Okay, and notice that if you only have the top part, you can't make the recipe. But if you only have the bottom part, you're not sure of what you need to make the recipe. In the language of the revised taxonomy, the top part is called factual knowledge. The bottom part is called procedural knowledge. How do they differ? The order of the top part doesn't make any difference. Whether you put artichoke hearts before mayonnaise, before Parmesan cheese, as a matter of fact, you can organize this so you can go shopping for them. It makes no difference. Put it in alphabetical order. But the organization of the bottom part is critical. That's why they're numbered. And if they're not numbered, the people give you some hints. They'll say things like first, second, next, then, finally. There's an order. Why? Because you can't mash before you drain. It doesn't work. I'll give you an example of this when I was in college and I didn't know how to cook even less than I do now. I was going to make pasta to impress a young lady that I invited over for dinner. So I got my boiling water, I got my water, and I got my pasta, and I got my salt. And then I decided, well, this can't be that hard. And I took the pasta and I put it in the water and I turned on the stove. Well, you see, I don't know if anybody has had that particular experience, but the result of that is basically wallpaper paste. It's not edible. Because step one, boil the water. Step two, add the pasta. Step three, add salt to taste. And if you really are concerned about the pasta sticking together, add a little oil. Sequence is important in procedural knowledge. The recipe is what I call the content. That's the content. I want them to learn the recipe. Next, please. Now, here's the choices you have. Oh, wait, I went too far. No, I'm okay. With respect to the verbs, this is where you have choices. So you got this recipe. What do you want them to do with the recipe? Do you want them to remember the recipe? You want them to understand each ingredient in case there's a need to make a substitution? I don't have any salad dressing. I don't have any mayonnaise. What am I going to do? Go to the store. I don't think so. Well, wait a second. What are the ingredients of mayonnaise? Can I make some? Do I have enough here? That requires understand. Apply. Do I want them to use the recipe to make the dip? Do I want them to analyze the recipe in terms of the relationships among the ingredients? How does this interact with that? What happens if I leave this out? Does it change this, that, or the other? Does it change texture? Does it change taste? Evaluate the recipe. Should I keep it? Or should I throw it away? Is it good? Keep it in my little booklet, or is it something I just don't want to eat again? Or, at the highest level, Do I want them to learn from this recipe so that they can create their own recipe? A new dip, a new appetizer. Okay, now that they've learned some of these other things. Now, with respect to knowledge, next one please. Remember we said that the ingredients are factual, the directions are procedural. One of the most interesting, okay, next one I guess we need, yeah. One of the most interesting is this notion of garlic salt optional. What kind of knowledge does that require? That requires what we call metacognitive knowledge. Knowledge of self, personalized knowledge. Knowledge of what you're good at and what you're not good at. Knowledge of what happens if I do this. Knowledge of, am I good at these tasks or that task? Knowledge of what strategies should I use to solve that problem. So if you like a lot of garlic salt, well, if you don't like garlic salt at all, then you don't put it in. But if you do like garlic salt, the next part of metacognitive is how much. How much garlic are you going to put in there? If you like a lot of garlic, you can put it all in there. Now, one of the problems here is don't make the other mistake I made when coming up with the next recipe that I almost failed with, actually did fail with this, thank goodness, the same girl went out with me twice, even after the first disaster. And I made beef stroganoff. And it said in the recipe, take a clove of garlic. Well, if you haven't chopped or you haven't done a lot of cooking, one of the first things you do is you take this thing of garlic and you say, gee, isn't it interesting that this clove has all these little parts? And you realize, no. The big one's the bulb. The little one's the cloves. So guess what happens if you add all the cloves of garlic to beef stroganoff? It's also inedible. And after 2 dates, that was the last time I saw the young lady, but enough of my sad story. It's your choice. That's what metacognitive knowledge is. Metacognitive knowledge also then adds kind of an affective component to it. What are you good at? What do you like? What don't you like? Are you afraid of mathematics? Do you have test anxiety? All that is part of what we call the latent curriculum. The things that aren't directly taught but are learned by process of being in school and classroom a lot. It's the personalized knowledge. Okay, next please. Okay, that leads us to the last type of knowledge, conceptual. Factual, procedural, metacognitive. If you know the composition of mayonnaise and its relationship to the other condiments, if you know how things fit together in a larger framework, if you know similarities and differences among different kinds of things, if you know how objectives are different from competencies, okay, you're working at a conceptual level. It's more abstract. It's less concrete. The way I used to teach this was, you see the floor? Okay, under here there's concrete. That's where we start, kids. You see up there? That's more abstract. And as you build connections down here, you come to here, you come to there, you come to there, and you're building what's called a conceptual framework. It's an abstract form of knowledge. And there you have your different kinds of things. Now, why are these things important? Next, please. If you have factual and procedural knowledge and you're not me, then you can cook. If you add conceptual knowledge, you are a cook. If you add metacognitive knowledge, you are or can be a chef. Now think of a student taking English literature or Mexican literature or science or mathematics. Let's take mathematics because it's just easier. Do you want students to just do math and not understand it? A colleague of ours named Eric DeCorta has a series of math questions to show how we teach math so poorly. One of the problems is called, how old is the captain? The captain is on a boat, and the boat has 13 ducks and 17 geese. How old is the captain? Number one answer given by students, 30. Does it make sense? No. But they know it's a math problem, and they know there's two numbers, and you know that couldn't be 4. You're not going to multiply them. Can't divide and get an equal number, 30. Okay, 30. Crazy, but it's the way life works. And he has a whole host of these, because we have a whole bunch of mathematics kids that are basically being taught in a conceptual, procedural way. Here are the facts, and here's how you do that. And here's some more facts, terms, and here's how you do that. And here's a few more. The big movement in mathematics has been to try to move math to a conceptual level so they can understand. One of the things they've come up with is this factor called in the States subitizing. Okay, subitizing, great concept. Subitizing means you can look at something and without counting tell how many there are. Okay? So, for example, let's suppose that a flock of geese fly over you, and you're able to take in, there's 4 in that group, 5 in that group, and 2 in that group. Total, 11. Didn't count them. I subitized. But that requires conceptual knowledge, that you're grouping and categorizing and seeing relationships. And how many of the kids that we teach in mathematics actually become mathematicians, become the chefs of our math? And how many, particularly women, drop out of mathematics and science as soon as they can because they never get beyond that first level. It never makes sense. And that's how you know if they're at level 2 or not. If kids are looking at math and saying, it just doesn't make sense, that's a level 1 kid. Okay? And so many of our students, when I go in to do classroom research, that's what they're telling me. I don't know, it just doesn't make sense. So, what are the lessons that we can learn from this? The same content can be the basis for many different objectives. Your objectives come partly from the content, but partly from what you expect students to learn from and with the content. That's why the balance is so important. Okay? Time is another reason the balance is so important. The more content you put per unit time, the less time you have to do the other tools. So I'm not advocating a whole bunch of facts, and I'm not advocating only creative. I'm advocating some logical balance within every single course. And secondly, the revised Bloom's taxonomy can be used with any content to formulate clear, specific, and understandable objectives. As somebody said to me when they sat in one of my things, you know, it gives you a common framework to think about things and a common language to talk about them. I'm happy. If you walk away saying, that's what I got, it was a common framework to think about things and it was a common language to talk about things, that's fine. But notice, because it's a heuristic, who does the thinking? You do. There aren't any right answers. Okay? One of my mottos in growing up was, I'd rather be consistent than right. Because I can control consistency. I can't control being right. All right. We're almost done. Let's skip that one. Oh, no, I can't skip that one. I'll show you how it works. That's a crappy old objective. The student will learn to apply the reduce, reuse, recycle approach to conservation. This is about a 7-year-old state objective in South Carolina. Okay, so how does it look? Next. We put it all together. All right? The verb is use, that's apply. Okay? Then we say it's an approach. An approach is basically a procedure, how to do it. So this is really an objective that focuses on apply procedural knowledge. And what's nice about that is everybody now can say to each other, across subject matter and grade level, how do you teach objectives where your emphasis is on applied procedural knowledge? How do you teach objectives when your emphasis is on analyzed conceptual knowledge? How do you build metacognitive knowledge within your students? And those questions are being asked across the board. Different countries, different cultures, different grades. All right, last thing. Next, please. So, once objectives are written, you can improve the validity and quality of our assessments for particular types of objectives. You can design instructional strategies and learning opportunities that are more likely to lead students to achieve the objectives. And in conclusion, we can move us as educators to go beyond what is, to consider what is possible. Or as Bloom says, it allows us to consider the varied possibilities of education. The choice of using this tool for ill or good is entirely up to you. Thank you very much.